Well, good evening. It's Diane Young here from South Pacific Private, and while we're just settling in and people are joining us for the Understanding the Family Dynamic and Gambling Addiction, I want to acknowledge that we're here today on the land of the Gayamagal people, part of the Eora Nation. The Gayamagal are the traditional owners of this saltwater country and are part of the oldest surviving continuous culture in the world. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I was just thinking a moment ago about what we would be talking about tonight in terms of gambling addiction and the family dynamic. And it's quite known that people who develop gambling addictions usually come from a family where gambling has been an acceptable pastime for, pleasure. So, you go to the club, you put some money in a pokies, or you go to put the frock on and the fascinator and go to the horses and the races. And there's a lot of socialisation around gambling, and it starts often very seductively and in a small way. Now, for those of us that know about addiction, there's little difference between gambling addiction, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, sex addiction. There are underlying issues of trauma in all of those addictions. Now, not everybody who has had trauma will become an addict, but the majority of people who develop some form of addiction have trauma in their history. And this can often be quite shocking for people when they come into recovery, when they actually start to see that they've got a problem. The telltale signs for gambling addiction are it's often done in secret. I've had plenty of clients who've been, the upstanding family member here, working, being part of their community, charity work, kids' sports. But over here they've got another bank account no one knows about, and they're funneling funds into that to gamble with. It will often be, it is really a very silent addiction. There can be many people that have significant gambling addictions and it will be totally unknown to those around them. And I think this is one of the things that is difficult for the family to accept, and it's very difficult for the person themselves to accept, because they become slightly delusional about what they are doing with their gambling addiction, and they make up a whole other story about why they're gambling the way they are. Very recently I was working with a client who's just coming into awareness around his gambling addiction, and he said to me there's a very strong distinction. This surprised me actually, I didn't know this. There's a very strong distinction between people who gamble on poker machines and people who gamble on, say, the races. And the considered view of the people that gamble on the races is that there's some skill involved in that, and they've got to actually deduce what, horse or dog to put the money on, whereas the poker machines, there's no skill in it. That was his view. That surprised me enormously. And I was fascinated by that, because again, the delusion is that if you're gambling on the horses, or this man's view was that I was gambling on the horses, there was skill in it, so I was actually a cut above everybody else. So maybe I'm not really an out of control gambler. I'm just exercising a skill that I have. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about there being a view about what delusion you're in about whether you're gambling too much. If you keep it secret from your family, if you have separate bank accounts from your partner, if you spend more time thinking about the gambling as opposed to anything else, so it becomes slightly obsessional. These are all signs that gambling's a problem for you. Now, the other side of all of this is that more often than not, it's not until people are in all sorts of strife with their gambling, ergo they've lost a lot, or they're about to lose a lot, or, that we've known of many who've embezzled money to gamble. And that's another one under the radar. It's not until people are actually on their knees and it's becoming public and known in the family system that anybody's forced to reach out for help. Now, the family dynamic will often be that the person who has the gambling addiction has come from some sort of gambling family where it's been an acceptable thing to do. I worked with a woman and it was just a social thing for her with her family. Everybody in the family gambled. It was an acceptable way of being. The interesting thing is the effect that that has on the brain is the same effect that an alcoholic or a drug addict or even a sex addict, it's the same part of the brain. So the dopamine hit you get with the pleasure of the win, or the dopamine hit you get the pleasure of not actually having to feel what's going on in here for you, is the thing that will keep the addiction going. There's always a debate about how much of an addiction, how addictions is a disease. And I'm of the belief that they are a disease. I'm also of the belief that if it was as simple as someone saying, oh dear, look, I've got a gambling addiction, oh dear, I've got an alcohol problem, I need to stop. And they did even some sort of treatment. They went into some sort of, even had some medication, whatever they were needing, they could stop. But it is known in the circles of those of us who work closely with people who are addicts that they need a whole lot more support than that. And one of the supports they need is to have information about how their history has impacted them, how any sort of trauma or abuse they may have experienced in their earlier life has impacted them. There's a very big correlation in the veteran community with gambling because they often suffer from PTSD or complex PTSD. There's very big connections with people who have gambling addictions and alcohol and drug addictions. And we see it all the time in South Pacific where people come in and admit to South Pacific to address their alcohol and drug addiction because it's very obvious. It's very obvious to the family that that's out of control. And what will often happen if they're lucky enough, and they won't think this is luck, but I think it is, if they're lucky enough in their 3-week admission and then the 2 weeks in the transitions program, they'll actually start to come into some honesty and awareness around the fact that, yes, they've got an alcohol and drug addiction, but they also have a gambling problem. Now, I've seen it plenty of times where people have gone into full recovery from alcohol and drug addiction. They may be in a 12-step program, they're working a solid program, and what will happen is because they haven't been able to drill down and look at their childhood trauma, the gambling will take over. In 12-step recovery, we often say, don't swap the witch for the bitch. And what we mean by that is don't deal with this alcohol and drug problem here, addiction, and not address the gambling as well. Because the gambling will take you straight back. You can't be in full recovery from alcohol and drugs if you're still gambling. So it's a complex condition. The family dynamic is often that the secrecy is not only about how much I'm gambling or how much I'm using, my time to be separate from the family. Pardon me. There will be times where the kids will feel like dad's not available or mum's not available and they won't know why. The advent of online betting and all of those, immediate, bet now, this is, there's a lot of animation, a lot of designs in those systems to get the people betting. And the other thing I wanted to mention about the dopamine, which I should have mentioned earlier, is we assume that the dopamine hit only comes when we win. And that's fundamentally true. But what will happen is every time a gambler, and this is the curiosity of gambling addiction, every time a gambler has a loss, they will then believe that they're closer to the next win. So chasing the dopamine hit because of the losses is a significant part of keeping you hooked in, particularly with the online and particularly with making sure that you don't have to feel what's going on here. Now, people who have come from a history of being some level of childhood trauma, some level of abuse, maybe it was bullying at school, maybe it was not feeling good enough, maybe it was the message you got when you were little about, you've really got to be achieving and making money and doing this. That will cause, that's the bedrock, it's like I've actually come from a place where I can't now feel my feelings in my body. I've locked in how I feel. I'm not letting anybody know. I can't tell anybody. And when I gamble, what happens to me is it takes me to a place where I don't have to feel any of this. And I said to a woman who came to see me about her gambling addiction quite recently, I said, when you gamble, how do you feel? And she looked at me a bit quizzically, like it had never been something she had considered. And she said, well, I don't think I feel anything really. And I said, would it be that when you gamble, when you get into the zone of the gambling, that you feel numb? Now, she had to think about it a bit, because this is her first foray into even thinking about whether she had an addiction or not. And she came back the next week and said to me, look, I've been thinking about that, and you're absolutely right. I feel numb when I gamble, so I don't have to feel any distress from here down. And I will often say to people, sex addicts particularly, big well of loneliness here. Alcoholics and addicts often have a sense of aloneness in here. Gamblers are the same. And whilst gambling it can be quite a solitary addiction, there is a sense of having people around you. If you're in a club or you're at the races, you can feel like you're part of something, even though you're doing everything you can to deaden the pain. At South Pacific, we treat gambling addiction seriously. We look at the underlying causes of what has driven you to start using gambling as a way of not feeling your feelings. We actually unpack with you what your life has been like up until that point. And we take a breath and gently, very gently guide you through to unpack the threads of where the trauma comes from. And if we can help you land in a place where you can recognise that some of those early childhood experiences have led you to this place where you want to actually deaden the pain and very, very gently start to actually work with the pain that you feel, you will be able to walk into recovery. Now, I'm a big advocate of Gamblers Anonymous. I know a number of people, families and family members of gamblers, who go to Gamanon, which is the 12-step program for family members of gamblers, and they get a lot of support from each other in those 12-step programs. There are a few places you can go in the world where you can really tell the truth to people about, that you don't know very well, by the way, about what's happening in your life, where you can actually be honest and not be judged. And 12-step programs are those places. So I can only suggest to you, if you have a family member who's gambling that you're worried about, if you have, or if in fact you're a gambler yourself, I would suggest you reach out to South Pacific There's a family education day program, very good for family members, which encompasses all of the things we do on the Pia Melody model of developmental immaturity, which is what trauma comes out of. And it will actually put you in a good position to then start attending your 12-step meeting and get some work. Now, as much as I know about being raised in a family of addiction, and I had a chronic gambling father and an alcoholic mother, what I learnt from a very young age was that it was my job to try and keep everything on track, whilst at the same time having no idea why it was in chaos. The house was in the chaos that it was. What I came to understand as I got into my own recovery was that when I would put my hands on everything, try to control everything, control how much my mother drank, I'd be pouring the Chateau Tanunda brandy down the sink when she was catatonic somewhere else, thinking I was helping, hiding any extra money I found in the house so my father wouldn't gamble. Like, that's going to stop anybody, right? But I don't know that. Like, I'm 8. What do I know? I think I'm helping. But, as an adult person dealing with someone else's addiction, irrespective of what it looks like, when I've got my hands on it and I'm trying to control the outcome of it, I'm trying to, keep an eye on what everybody else is doing, it makes no difference. It doesn't help. In fact, they just go further underground. The real trick with being a family member of someone who has an addiction is to take our hands off. Now, I know, for those of you that are listening, that live with it, you're going to think, that's insane. I can't do that. It will be total chaos. Right? What I do know is that if we stop trying to enable them, if we stop trying to caretake them, if we stop trying to prevent them getting into trouble at work or, protect them from someone else's view in the family, they have to then start taking responsibility for what is happening in their life. They have to take responsibility for how they are and what sort of addiction is playing out in their life. It's critical for family members to take their hands off. But you cannot do that unless you get lots of support, whether it's therapeutic support yourself, go to Gamanon or any of the, the Al-Anon, 12-step programs that are for family and friends of people with addiction. It's a massive problem. And as we started to unpack what we're going to talk about tonight, it became very obvious to all of us, we know, it's a disease, gambling addiction's a disease of secrecy. It flies under the radar until it doesn't. And usually by the time it doesn't, there's a whole lot of damage being done. And I would ask any of you who are struggling with the disease of gambling addiction, or someone who is family or friend member of it, of someone who's in that addiction, to get help for yourself, irrespective. Because a lot of people who aren't the addict, the family members, will be pointing at the addict going, well, if you just stopped gambling and you did this and you did this and you did this, then we'd be okay. Now, at one level that's right, but look at my hand. If I'm pointing at you and you're the problem, where are the other 3 fingers pointing? Back here. So my work is here. I can't control what you did. Alan and I have a great saying. I didn't cause it, I can't cure it, and I can't control it. And that's very sobering for people who have, very sobering for people that have gambling addiction. So there's also, don't ever forget to also, just let me remind you, the self-assessments on the South Pacific website. There's some blogs up on the South Pacific website about gambling and gambling addiction. They're well worth a read. I think we can accept that, codependency, trauma, it's a perfect storm. We need to address it on a number of levels. And I think we do that very beautifully at South Pacific. We don't just go in and just look at the addiction, we look at the underlying causes and conditions, and it's very important. So David's posted, it can be very confronting to come to terms that often with addiction, the unaddicted partner plays a role in the dance of toxic codependency. Well, isn't that true? But both can heal and do heal. And that's absolutely right, because the couples I see where one goes into recovery for their addiction and the other one goes into recovery for their own history, they actually navigate it through beautifully. They take a lot of time and they're kind to one another, and they'll often do, you know, it's a commitment, I grant you. Do your own therapy, do your couples therapy. You know, perhaps the addict goes into South Pacific. Sometimes I've had plenty of times where the addict's gone into South Pacific and then they've come out and then the partner's gone in to look at their own history. And one of the advantages of that one is that they start speaking the same language, and they start to see that everything that I do impacts you and everything that you do impacts me, and we can navigate this together, as David said. So we're coming to the end of our talk tonight. I want to thank you for those of you who have logged on tonight. I think it's cunning, baffling and powerful, this one. And I think we need a lot of help to navigate it. And help is available. 1-800-063-332 is the South Pacific number. Thank you, Linky. And it's the one place that we, you know, can offer no judgment, come as you are, and we can get help for you. Help is available, and you do not have to suffer alone, and you do not have to try and recover on your own. So thank you, Denise. Thank you, Linky. Very good to see you. Thank you very much. See you next time.